The autumn of 1879 painted the New England countryside in shades of rust and decay, as if nature itself mourned the passing of Silas Thornley. The train's whistle pierced through the thick fog that clung to the valleys like ghostly fingers, announcing the arrival of the 417 from Boston to the small station of Millbrook. Elijah Thornley stepped onto the wooden platform, his polished boots clicking against the damp planks. At 26, he possessed the sharp features characteristic of his bloodline: angular cheekbones, piercing grey eyes, and prematurely silver-streaked hair that caught the dying light. The townspeople who had gathered to witness his return quickly averted their gazes, crossing themselves or clutching their children closer. "Mr. Thornley," called out Thomas Whitmore, the family's longtime groundskeeper. His weathered face bore the weight of decades spent in service to the Thornley estate, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for Elijah's traveling case. I'm sorry for your loss, sir." Elijah nodded curtly, studying the man's nervous demeanor. "How long has it been since Father's passing, Thomas?" 3 weeks come tomorrow, sir. The funeral was, well, it was a small affair. Most folks in town." Thomas's voice trailed off, his eyes darting toward the cluster of onlookers who whispered among themselves. "Most folks were too frightened to pay their respects," Elijah finished, a bitter smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I see little has changed in my absence." The carriage ride to Thornley Manor took them through winding dirt roads flanked by ancient oaks whose gnarled branches seemed to reach out like arthritic fingers. The fog grew thicker as they ascended the hill, muffling the sound of the horses' hooves and creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made even the familiar landscape feel foreign and menacing. As they crested the final hill, the manor emerged from the mist, like a sleeping giant awakening from a troubled dream. Built from dark granite, quarried from the nearby mountains, the three-story structure dominated the landscape with its imposing presence. Gothic windows stared down like hollow eyes, and the slate roof, green with age and moss, gave the building an organic quality that suggested it had grown from the earth rather than been constructed upon it. "The house has been restless since the master's passing," Thomas murmured as they approached the circular drive. "Strange sounds at night, doors opening and closing on their own. Mrs. Hartwell, the cook, she's been staying in town most evenings." Elijah's jaw tightened. He had spent the last 8 years in Boston, studying law and attempting to distance himself from the shadow of his family's reputation. But even there, whispers had followed him. Stories of the Thornley curse, of unexplained deaths and dark rituals that supposedly took place within the manor's walls. The massive oak doors, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the flickering light of Thomas's lantern, groaned open to reveal the grand foyer. Dust motes danced in the amber glow, and the air carried the scent of old wood, leather, and something else, something metallic and unpleasant that made Elijah's stomach turn. "I've prepared your father's study for you, sir," Thomas said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "All his papers and personal effects are as he left them." Elijah's footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he made his way through the familiar corridors. Family portraits lined the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to follow his progress. Each generation of Thornley men bore the same sharp features, the same penetrating gaze, and the same subtle expression of cruelty that had marked the family for over a century. The study door stood slightly ajar, and as Elijah pushed it open, the hinges released a prolonged creak that seemed to announce his arrival to the house itself. The room was exactly as he remembered. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, a massive mahogany desk positioned before tall windows that looked out onto the family cemetery, and the ever-present portrait of the family patriarch, Ezekiel Thornley, whose cold eyes had watched over generations of his descendants. On the desk lay a stack of correspondence, legal documents, and what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. Elijah approached cautiously, his fingers trailing along the desk's polished surface until they encountered something unexpected. a small brass key, ornate and old, lying beside an envelope bearing his name in his father's distinctive handwriting. With trembling hands, he broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter within. My dear son, if you are reading this, then the inevitable has come to pass, and I have joined our ancestors in whatever realm awaits beyond the veil. Do not mourn my passing, for death is but another chapter in the Thornley legacy, a legacy that now falls to you. You have spent these past years running from your birthright, believing that distance could cleanse you of what flows in your veins. But blood calls to blood, Elijah, and the darkness that has sustained our family for generations cannot be denied forever. The key you have found opens a door that has remained sealed since your departure. In the attic, behind the false wall where your grandfather once kept his most precious possessions, you will find the true history of our lineage. Read it well, my son, for understanding your heritage is the first step toward embracing your destiny. The townspeople fear us for good reason. We are not like them, nor should we aspire to be. We are the inheritors of something far older and more powerful than their simple minds can comprehend. What they call evil, we know to be strength. What they call madness, we understand to be clarity. Do not fight what you are, Elijah. Embrace it as I did, as my father did before me, and his father before him. The blood remembers, even when the mind forgets. Your devoted father, Silas Thornley P.S. Trust no one in town. They would see our line ended if they could, but they lack the courage to act directly. They will watch and wait, hoping you will be the one to break the chain. Prove them wrong. Elijah's hands shook as he set the letter aside. The rational part of his mind, the part shaped by years of legal study and city living, wanted to dismiss his father's words as the ravings of a disturbed man. But something deeper, something that had always lurked in the shadows of his consciousness, recognized the truth in those carefully penned lines. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the study windows. As if summoned by the storm, memories began to surface, fragments of his childhood that he had spent years trying to suppress. Late-night sounds from the basement, his father's unexplained absences, the way animals would flee when the family approached, and most disturbing of all, the dreams that had plagued him since boyhood. Dreams of dark rituals and ancient powers that felt more like memories than fantasies. The brass key felt warm in his palm, almost alive, as if it were eager to fulfill its purpose. Elijah looked up at the portrait of Ezekiel Thornley, and for a moment he could have sworn the painted eyes blinked. Outside, the storm was gathering strength, and somewhere in the depths of the manor, a door creaked open on its own, as if the house itself were welcoming its prodigal son home. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight as Elijah climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, the brass key clutched tightly in his fist. Each step groaned under his weight, the sound echoing through the sleeping house like a funeral dirge. The storm outside had intensified, sending sheets of rain against the windows and causing the old manor to creak and settle in ways that seemed almost conversational. The attic door stood before him, its dark wood scarred by decades of neglect. As he inserted the key into the lock, it turned with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The door swung open to reveal a space that defied the manor's otherwise immaculate condition. Dust-covered furniture draped in white sheets, stacks of moldering books, and portraits of long-dead relatives whose eyes seemed to track his movement through the gloom. Elijah lit the oil lamp he had brought from the study, its warm glow pushing back the shadows and revealing the full extent of the attic's contents. According to his father's letter, there was a false wall somewhere in this maze of forgotten belongings. He began his search methodically, running his hands along the wooden panels that lined the room's perimeter. Near the far corner, behind a towering armoire that required considerable effort to move, his fingers detected a subtle difference in the wall's texture. What appeared to be solid wood gave way under pressure, revealing a hidden panel that swung inward on silent hinges. Beyond lay a small chamber, no larger than a closet, but what it contained made Elijah's breath catch in his throat. The space was lined with shelves, holding an assortment of objects that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the lamplight. Ancient books bound in what looked suspiciously like human skin, glass vials containing unidentifiable substances, and artifacts of bone and metal that hurt to look at directly. But it was the collection of journals, dozens of them, each bearing the name of a different Thornley patriarch, that drew his attention. With trembling hands, he selected the oldest volume, its leather cover cracked and stained with age. The name Ezekiel Thornley, 1743, was embossed in faded gold lettering on the spine. As he opened it, the pages released a musty odor that seemed to carry whispers of long-dead voices. The entries were written in a careful, educated hand, but the content made Elijah's skin crawl. 15th day of October, 1743. The ritual is complete. The pact has been sealed with blood and sacrifice, as the ancient texts demanded. In exchange for our family's prosperity and longevity, we have bound ourselves to serve the old ones when they call. Each generation must honor this covenant, or face consequences too terrible to contemplate. The townspeople suspect nothing. They see only our sudden wealth and attribute it to shrewd business dealings. If only they knew the true price of our success, the lives we have taken, the souls we have claimed in service to powers beyond their comprehension. My son, Jeremiah, shows promise. The darkness runs strong in his veins, and he has already begun to hear the whispers that guide our family's actions. Soon, I will initiate him into the full truth of our heritage. Elijah's hands shook as he turned the pages, each entry revealing new horrors. Ezekiel wrote of midnight ceremonies in the basement, of sacrifices made to entities whose names were written in symbols that seemed to writhe on the page. He described the construction of hidden chambers beneath the manor, designed to contain things that should never see the light of day. But it was the final entry that made Elijah's blood run cold. 3rd day of November, 1743. The transformation is beginning. I can feel the change in my very bones, the awakening of abilities that mark me as something more than human. The hunger grows stronger each day, not for food or drink, but for the life force of others. This is the true gift of our pact, the source of our family's power. I have prepared detailed instructions for my descendants. Each must embrace this gift when their time comes, or risk not only their own destruction, but the unraveling of everything our family has built. The blood remembers even when the mind rebels. To my future sons, do not fear what you are becoming. Embrace the darkness, for it is your birthright and your strength. Elijah slammed the journal shut, his heart pounding. He reached for another volume, this one bearing his grandfather's name, Mordecai Thornley, 1821. The entries followed a similar pattern, descriptions of rituals, sacrifices, and the gradual transformation from human to something else entirely. One passage made him pause. The townspeople grow suspicious. 3 children have gone missing this month, and they whisper of curses and dark magic. I must be more careful in my selections, choosing victims who will not be missed. The homeless, the traveling merchants, the outcasts, they serve our purposes well, and their disappearances raise fewer questions. My son Silas shows great potential. At only 12 years of age, he has already demonstrated an aptitude for the family arts. Yesterday, I caught him torturing a cat in the garden, and the look of pure joy on his face filled me with pride. He will make a worthy successor. The sound of footsteps in the hallway below made Elijah freeze. He extinguished the lamp and listened intently, but the house had fallen silent again. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, as if unseen eyes were monitoring his every move. He selected one more journal, his father's, dated from the 1850s onward. Silas Thornley's handwriting was more erratic than his predecessors. The letters sometimes scratched so deeply into the paper that they tore through to the pages beneath. The hunger is becoming unbearable. It has been 3 weeks since the last feeding, and I can feel my strength waning. The ritual chamber calls to me, demanding fresh sacrifice to maintain the family's power. But Elijah grows older and more observant. Soon, I will have no choice but to reveal the truth to him, as my father did to me. I have tried to shield him from our true nature, hoping against hope that the bloodline might skip a generation. But I see the signs, the way animals flee from his presence, the dreams that wake him screaming in the night, the cold intelligence that sometimes flickers behind his eyes. The darkness is awakening in him, whether I will it or not. Perhaps it is time to prepare him. The old ways must continue, and I grow weary of bearing this burden alone. Elijah's vision blurred as he read his father's words. Everything began to make sense. His childhood nightmares, his instinctive aversion to certain people, the way he had always felt different from his peers. The rational part of his mind still fought against acceptance, but deep down he knew the truth. A sudden crash from somewhere in the house made him jump. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the manor, followed by what might have been footsteps, or might have been the settling of old wood. Elijah quickly gathered several of the journals and made his way back through the hidden panel, his heart racing. As he descended the attic stairs, the temperature seemed to drop noticeably. His breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and the shadows appeared to move independently of his lamp's flickering flame. At the bottom of the stairs, he paused, listening for any sign of an intruder. The sound came again, a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against wood, emanating from the direction of the basement. Elijah's blood ran cold as he remembered his father's journal entries about the ritual chamber below. Whatever was down there, it seemed to know he had discovered the family's secrets. The tapping grew more insistent, almost urgent, as if something were trying to communicate with him. Against every instinct screaming at him to flee, Elijah found himself drawn toward the basement door. His hand reached for the handle of its own accord, and as his fingers made contact with the cold metal, a voice whispered in his mind. A voice that sounded disturbingly like his own. "Come home, Elijah. Come home and claim your birthright." The basement door creaked open, revealing a darkness so complete that his lamp's light seemed to be swallowed by it. From the depths below came the sound of something large stirring, and the air carried a scent that was both familiar and terrifying. The metallic tang of old blood mixed with something far more ancient and corrupt. Elijah stood at the threshold, the journals clutched against his chest, knowing that whatever lay below would change him forever. The rational man he had tried to become warred with the darkness that had always lurked in his blood, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't certain which side would win. The basement stairs descended into a darkness that seemed to possess weight and substance, pressing against Elijah like a living thing. Each step downward brought a corresponding drop in temperature, until his breath formed visible clouds in the frigid air. The oil lamp's flame flickered wildly, as if struggling against some unseen force that sought to extinguish it entirely. The stone walls were older than the house above, carved from the same dark granite, but bearing symbols that predated any known civilization. As Elijah's light played across their surface, the carved figures seemed to writhe and dance, depicting scenes of ritual sacrifice and otherworldly communion that made his stomach churn. Yet something deep within him recognized these images, as if they were memories rather than mere carvings. At the bottom of the stairs, a long corridor stretched into the darkness, lined with iron doors that stood slightly ajar. The air here was thick with the scent of decay and something else, something that reminded him of the copper taste that filled his mouth during his childhood nightmares. From behind one of the doors came a sound like whispered prayers, though the words were in no language he recognized. Elijah approached the first door cautiously, his lamp held high. The chamber beyond was small and circular, its walls lined with shelves containing glass jars filled with floating specimens. As his light illuminated their contents, he recoiled in horror. Human organs suspended in yellowing fluid, each jar carefully labeled with dates going back over a century. Hearts, livers, eyes, all preserved with meticulous care, as if they were precious artifacts rather than the remnants of murder. The second chamber contained something even more disturbing. Chains hung from the ceiling and walls, their metal stained with rust and darker substances. A stone altar dominated the center of the room, its surface carved with channels that led to a drain in the floor. The stone was stained black, with what could only be centuries of spilled blood, and the air here was so thick with the residue of violence that Elijah could barely breathe. But it was the third chamber that made him understand the true scope of his family's evil. This room was larger than the others, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that his lamp couldn't penetrate. The walls were covered with more of the ancient symbols, but these seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence, as if lit from within by some unholy fire. In the center of the room stood a massive stone circle, its perimeter marked by 13 smaller stones, each carved with a different symbol. Within the circle, the floor was inlaid with what appeared to be silver, forming an intricate pattern that hurt to look at directly. And at the very center, rising from the floor like a twisted tree, was a structure of bone and metal that defied description. Part altar, part throne, part gateway to something that should not exist. As Elijah stepped into the chamber, the symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, and he heard something that made his blood freeze. The sound of his own voice, chanting in that same unknown language he had heard from the first chamber. But his lips weren't moving, and the voice seemed to come from the structure at the center of the circle. "Welcome home, my son." Elijah spun around, his lamp casting wild shadows across the walls. Standing in the doorway was a figure that might have been his father, but wrong in ways that made his eyes water to perceive. Silas Thornley's form flickered between solid flesh and something else, something that belonged more to shadow than substance. His eyes were black pits that seemed to contain swirling galaxies, and when he smiled, his teeth were too sharp and too numerous. "You're dead," Elijah whispered, backing toward the stone circle. "I saw your grave." "Death is a concept for lesser beings," the thing that had been his father replied, its voice echoing from multiple directions at once. "We Thornleys transcend such limitations. The pact our ancestor made ensures that we continue, in one form or another, as long as the bloodline endures." The apparition moved closer, and Elijah could see that its feet didn't quite touch the ground. "You've read the journals. You know what we are, what you are destined to become. The hunger grows stronger each day, doesn't it? The dreams become more vivid, more real. Soon, you won't be able to resist." Elijah's hand went instinctively to his throat, where he could feel his pulse racing. But beneath the fear, something else was stirring, a dark excitement that terrified him more than any ghost. "I won't become like you. I won't hurt innocent people." "Innocent?" The spectre laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "There are no innocent people, Elijah. There are only predators and prey, and we are the apex predators. The townspeople who whisper about our family, who cross themselves when they see us, they would burn us alive if they had the courage. They fear us because they recognize what we truly are." The symbols on the walls pulsed brighter, and Elijah felt something stirring in his blood, a warmth that spread through his veins like liquid fire. His vision sharpened, allowing him to see details in the darkness that should have been impossible. The scent of fear and old blood became intoxicating rather than repulsive, and he found himself taking deeper breaths, savoring the aroma. "You feel it, don't you?" his father's spirit whispered. The awakening, the transformation that has been building since the day you were born. You can fight it, but you cannot stop it. The blood remembers, even when the mind rebels. Elijah stumbled backward until he felt the cold stone of the circle against his legs. The moment his body made contact with the ancient structure, the chamber exploded with light. The symbols blazed like stars, and the bone and metal construct at the center began to emit a low, thrumming sound that seemed to resonate in his very bones. Images flooded his mind, memories that weren't his own, but belonged to every Thornley who had come before. He saw Ezekiel making the original pact with entities that existed before human civilization, trading his family's humanity for power and longevity. He witnessed generations of Thornleys feeding the hunger that sustained them, taking lives to maintain their unnatural existence. But he also saw the price they paid, the gradual erosion of their humanity, the transformation from men into something else entirely. Each generation became more monstrous than the last, until they were barely recognizable as having once been human. "The choice is yours," the spectre said, its form beginning to fade as the light intensified. "Embrace your heritage and live forever as we do, or fight it and watch everything our family has built crumble to dust. But know this, the hunger will not be denied. If you don't feed it willingly, it will take what it needs regardless of your wishes." The light reached a crescendo, and suddenly Elijah was alone in the chamber. But he was no longer the same man who had descended into the basement. Something fundamental had changed within him, awakened by his contact with the ritual circle. His senses were heightened to an almost painful degree, and he could hear the heartbeats of every living creature within miles. More disturbing still was the hunger that now gnawed at his insides, not for food, but for something far more precious. He could sense the life force of the few remaining servants in the house above, could almost taste the warmth of their blood. The rational part of his mind recoiled in horror, but another part, a part that was growing stronger by the moment, whispered that taking what he needed would be so easy, so satisfying. Elijah fled the chamber, racing up the stairs and through the manor's corridors until he reached his father's study. But even there, surrounded by the familiar trappings of civilization, he couldn't escape what he had become. The transformation was accelerating, and he could feel his humanity slipping away like sand through his fingers. Outside, dawn was breaking over the New England countryside, but for Elijah Thornley, the darkness was just beginning. The blood had remembered, and there would be no going back. 3 days had passed since Elijah's encounter in the ritual chamber, and the hunger had grown from a whisper to a roar. He had tried to ignore it, to maintain some semblance of his former life, but the transformation was relentless. His reflection in mirrors had begun to waver, sometimes showing glimpses of something that wasn't entirely human. His canine teeth had grown noticeably sharper, and his eyes had developed an unsettling luminescence that seemed to glow in the darkness. The servants had begun to avoid him, crossing themselves when they thought he wasn't looking. Mrs. Hartwell, the cook, had taken to leaving his meals outside the study door rather than facing him directly. Even Thomas, loyal as he was, could barely meet Elijah's gaze without trembling. It was on the 4th morning that the hunger finally overwhelmed his resistance. Elijah had spent the night pacing the manor's corridors, fighting the urges that clawed at his consciousness like caged animals. Every heartbeat in the house called to him. Every pulse of warm blood through human veins was a siren song that grew harder to resist. By dawn, his hands were shaking, and a cold sweat had broken out across his fevered skin. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway made him freeze. Through the study door, he could hear Mrs. Hartwell humming softly to herself as she went about her morning duties. The melody was cheerful and innocent, a stark contrast to the dark thoughts that consumed his mind. But beneath the humming, he could hear something else, the steady rhythm of her heart, pumping the life-giving fluid that his transformed body craved. Without conscious thought, Elijah found himself opening the study door. Mrs. Hartwell stood, with her back to him, dusting the family portraits that lined the hallway. She was a woman in her 50s, plump and motherly, who had worked for the Thornley family for over 2 decades. She had been kind to him as a child, sneaking him extra sweets and comforting him after his nightmares. "Good morning, Master Elijah," she said without turning around, her voice carefully neutral. "I've left your breakfast on the tray. Cook made your favorite—" Her words died in her throat as she turned and saw him standing in the doorway. Whatever she saw in his face made her drop the feather duster, her hand flying to her throat in an instinctive gesture of protection. "Master Elijah?" she whispered, backing away from him. Are you feeling well, sir?" Elijah tried to speak, to reassure her, but the words wouldn't come. The hunger had taken control, reducing his consciousness to that of a passenger in his own body. He watched in horror as his hands reached for her, moving with inhuman speed and strength. Misses. Hartwell's scream was cut short as his fingers closed around her throat. Her eyes widened in terror and confusion, and in them Elijah saw the reflection of what he had become, something monstrous wearing his face. She struggled briefly, her hands clawing at his arms, but the transformation had given him strength far beyond that of any normal man. The moment her life force began to flow into him, Elijah understood why his ancestors had embraced this existence. The sensation was indescribable, pure ecstasy that flooded every cell of his being with warmth and power. Her memories flashed through his mind like pages in a book. Her childhood in Ireland, her journey to America, her years of faithful service to his family. He experienced her love for her late husband, her pride in her grown children, her simple pleasures and quiet fears, and then it was over. Mrs. Hartwell's body crumpled to the floor, her face frozen in an expression of betrayal and terror. The warmth of her life force still coursed through Elijah's veins, but it was tainted now by the horror of what he had done. "No," he whispered, falling to his knees beside her still form. "No, no, no." But even as he mourned her death, another part of him, the part that was no longer entirely human, was already calculating how to dispose of the body, how to explain her disappearance. The rational mind that had once defined him was being systematically overwritten by something far older and more primal. The sound of approaching footsteps made him look up. Thomas stood at the end of the hallway, his face pale with shock. The old groundskeeper's eyes moved from Elijah's blood-stained hands to Mrs. Hartwell's lifeless form, and understanding dawned in his weathered features. "Dear God," Thomas breathed, crossing himself. "It's true, all the stories, all the whispers. It's all true." Elijah rose slowly, his movements predatory and fluid. The hunger had been temporarily sated, but he could feel it stirring again, awakened by the taste of human life. Thomas represented a threat, a witness who could expose what had happened. But more than that, he represented another source of the sustenance that Elijah's transformed body now required. "Thomas," Elijah said, his voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before. "You've served my family faithfully for so many years. You understand the importance of loyalty, don't you?" The old man backed away, his hand fumbling for the cross that hung around his neck. "Stay back, Master Elijah. I know what you are now. I know what your father was, what your grandfather was. The whole family, cursed and damned." "Cursed?" Elijah laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the hallway. "We're not cursed, Thomas. We're evolved. We're what humanity could become if it had the courage to transcend its limitations." Thomas turned and ran, his aged legs carrying him toward the front door with surprising speed. But Elijah was faster, impossibly, inhumanly fast. He caught the groundskeeper before he could reach the exit, his hand closing around the man's shoulder with enough force to crack bone. "Please," Thomas gasped, tears streaming down his face. "I have grandchildren. They need me." For a moment, Elijah hesitated. The human part of him, the part that remembered kindness and compassion, fought against the hunger. But the transformation was too far advanced, the new nature too strong to resist. With a sound that was part sigh and part growl, he gave in to what he had become. The second feeding was easier than the first. Thomas's life force was weaker, tainted by age and fear, but it still provided the sustenance that Elijah's body craved. As the old man's memories flooded through him, decades of faithful service, knowledge of the family's dark secrets, love for his own family, Elijah felt the last vestiges of his humanity slip away. When it was over, he stood alone in the hallway with two corpses at his feet. The rational part of his mind catalogued the practical concerns. The bodies would need to be disposed of, their disappearances explained, new servants found who wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions. But these thoughts felt distant, academic, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. The hunger was already stirring again, weaker now, but persistent. 2 lives had barely been enough to sustain him, and he could sense that his needs would only grow stronger as the transformation completed itself. The townspeople of Millbrook, with their warm blood and beating hearts, called to him like a feast waiting to be consumed. Elijah Thornley walked to the window and looked out at the town below, its chimney smoke rising into the grey morning sky. Somewhere down there, people were going about their daily lives, unaware that death had awakened in the manor on the hill. They feared the Thornley name, whispered stories of dark magic and ancient curses, but they had no idea how close to the truth their superstitions really were. The blood had remembered, and it was hungry for more. As he stood there planning his next move, Elijah caught sight of his reflection in the window glass. The face that looked back at him was his own, but changed in subtle ways that marked him as something other than human. His eyes held depths that seemed to contain centuries of accumulated darkness, and when he smiled, his teeth gleamed like polished ivory daggers. The transformation was nearly complete, and with it came a terrible clarity. He understood now why his ancestors had embraced this existence, why they had fed the hunger generation after generation. It wasn't just about survival, it was about power, about transcending the limitations that bound ordinary mortals. The Thornley legacy would continue, and the town below would provide all the sustenance he needed to ensure that it thrived for generations to come. Winter had settled over Millbrook like a burial shroud, and with it came a series of disappearances that sent ripples of terror through the small New England town. 7 people had vanished without a trace over the past 3 months. A traveling merchant, 2 drifters seeking work, a widow who lived alone on the outskirts of town, and 3 others whose absence was noted only when their bodies were eventually needed for burial. The townspeople whispered of wolves, of bandits, of anything that might explain the growing list of the missing. But the older residents, those who remembered the stories their grandparents had told, spoke in hushed tones of the Thornley curse and the evil that dwelt in the manor on the hill. Elijah had become a master of his new existence. The transformation was complete now, leaving him something that wore human form, but possessed capabilities far beyond mortal limitations. He could move through the darkness like a living shadow, his senses so acute that he could track a heartbeat from miles away. The hunger that had once tormented him was now a familiar companion, its demands met with calculated precision. He had learned to choose his victims carefully, those who wouldn't be missed, whose disappearances could be attributed to the harsh realities of frontier life. The ritual chamber beneath the manor had become his sanctuary, its ancient stones stained with fresh blood that fed the otherworldly entities his family had served for generations. But on this particular night, as snow fell in thick curtains across the landscape, Elijah's carefully maintained existence was about to face its greatest challenge. Dr. Marcus Whitmore, Thomas's nephew and the town's only physician, had been conducting his own investigation into the disappearances. Unlike the other townspeople who preferred to attribute the vanishings to supernatural causes rather than face a more tangible threat, Marcus approached the mystery with scientific methodology and grim determination. He had noticed patterns that others missed, the way the missing persons had all been seen near the old forest road that led to Thornley Manor. The strange reports of lights in the manor's windows at all hours of the night, and most disturbing of all, the complete absence of his Uncle Thomas, who had simply vanished without collecting his final wages or saying goodbye to his family. Marcus stood now in his study, surrounded by maps, newspaper clippings, and detailed notes chronicling every disappearance. A man in his early 30s with prematurely grey hair and intelligent brown eyes, he possessed the kind of analytical mind that refused to accept easy explanations for complex problems. The medical training he had received in Boston had taught him to look for evidence, to follow symptoms to their source, and what he had discovered pointed to a conclusion that chilled him to the bone. The knock at his door came just after midnight, soft and hesitant. Marcus set down his pen and listened, wondering who would call at such an hour. The knock came again, more insistent this time, accompanied by a woman's voice calling his name. "Dr. Whitmore? Please, I need your help. It's my daughter. She's terribly ill." Marcus recognized the voice as belonging to Sarah Mitchell, a young widow who lived in a cottage at the edge of town with her 8-year-old daughter Emma. He had treated the child before for minor ailments and knew Sarah to be a devoted mother who would never venture out in such weather unless the situation was truly desperate. He opened the door to find Sarah standing on his doorstep, her dark hair dusted with snow and her face etched with worry. But something about her appearance struck him as odd. Her cheeks were too pale, her breathing too steady for someone who had supposedly rushed through a blizzard to seek medical help. "Sarah," he said, stepping aside to let her enter, "what's wrong with Emma?" "She's burning with fever," Sarah replied, her voice carrying an odd musical quality that seemed to resonate in his bones. "She keeps calling for you, saying you're the only one who can help her." Marcus grabbed his medical bag and coat, his professional instincts overriding the nagging sense that something wasn't right. As they stepped out into the storm, Sarah took his arm, her grip surprisingly strong for such a delicate-looking woman. "This way," she said, leading him not toward her cottage, but toward the forest road that wound up to Thornley Manor. "Sarah, your cottage is in the other direction," Marcus said, trying to pull away from her grasp. She turned to look at him, and in the pale moonlight filtering through the snow clouds, he saw that her eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire visible surface, like looking into twin voids. "Sarah Mitchell died 3 weeks ago," she said in a voice that was no longer her own. "I'm something else wearing her face." Marcus tried to run, but found that his legs wouldn't obey his commands. The thing that looked like Sarah smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous, and he realized with growing horror that he was looking at one of Elijah Thornley's victims, transformed into something that served its killer's will. "He's been waiting for you, Doctor," the Sarah thing continued, its grip on his arm tightening until he could feel his bones grinding together. "You've been asking too many questions, getting too close to the truth. Master Elijah doesn't like that." They walked through the storm in silence, Marcus's body moving against his will while his mind screamed in terror. The forest around them seemed alive with malevolent presence, shadows that moved independently of the wind, sounds that might have been whispers or might have been the cries of the dead. Thornley Manor loomed before them like a cancer against the night sky, its windows glowing with an unholy light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing Elijah Thornley standing in the threshold. But this was not the man Marcus remembered from their brief encounters in town. The thing that wore Elijah's face had been transformed by months of feeding and communion with otherworldly forces. Its skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality that revealed the network of black veins beneath. Its eyes burned with an inner fire that hurt to look at directly, and when it smiled, the expression held no trace of human warmth. "Dr. Whitmore," Elijah said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. "How good of you to accept my invitation. I trust Sarah was persuasive." The Sarah thing released Marcus's arm and stepped back, its form beginning to waver like heat shimmer. "He knows too much, Master. His investigation threatens our secrecy." "Indeed," Elijah nodded, studying Marcus with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. "Tell me, Doctor, what conclusions have you drawn from your research?" Marcus found that he could speak again, though his body remained paralyzed. "You're killing them," he whispered. "All the missing people, you're murdering them." "Murder?" Elijah laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the manor's foyer. "Such a crude term for what is actually a form of communion." "I don't simply kill them, Doctor. I absorb their essence, their memories, their very souls. They become part of something greater than they ever could have been in life." He gestured toward the Sarah thing, which had now become translucent enough that Marcus could see through it to the wall beyond. Sarah Mitchell was a frightened widow, struggling to raise her child alone. Now she serves a purpose that transcends her mortal limitations. Her daughter, incidentally, provided excellent sustenance. Children's life force is particularly pure. The casual mention of Emma's death hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had delivered that child, had watched her take her first breath, had treated her scraped knees and childhood fevers. The thought of her innocent life being consumed by this monster filled him with a rage that temporarily overcame his fear. "You're insane," he snarled. "You're a sick, twisted—" "I'm evolved," Elijah interrupted, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality. "I'm what humanity could become if it had the courage to transcend its biological limitations. My family has served powers older than civilization itself, and in return, we've been granted abilities that make us more than human." He began to circle Marcus like a predator stalking its prey. "You've studied medicine, Doctor. You understand the concept of symbiosis, of one organism benefiting from its relationship with another. That's all this is. A symbiotic relationship between my family and forces that exist beyond the veil of ordinary reality. The people you've killed have been honored to contribute to something greater than themselves," Elijah finished. "Their deaths serve a purpose that their mundane lives never could have achieved. Through me, they become part of a legacy that spans centuries." Marcus felt his paralysis beginning to fade, but he knew it was intentional. Elijah was allowing him to move, confident in his ability to recapture his prey at will. The doctor looked around the foyer, noting the family portraits whose subjects seemed to watch him with malevolent interest, the shadows that moved independently of any light source, the pervasive sense of wrongness that permeated the very air. "The townspeople know," Marcus said, playing for time while he searched for any possible means of escape. "They're already suspicious. If I disappear too, they'll come looking." "Will they?" Elijah smiled. "The people of Millbrook are cowards, Doctor. They whisper and cross themselves and tell stories to frighten their children, but they lack the courage to act. They've known about my family's true nature for generations, yet they've never done anything more than avoid us." He was right, and Marcus knew it. The townspeople were too frightened of the Thornley name to mount any kind of organized resistance. They would mourn his disappearance, perhaps even suspect the truth, but they would ultimately do nothing. "However," Elijah continued, "your investigation has been more thorough than I anticipated. You've documented patterns, collected evidence, drawn conclusions that come uncomfortably close to the truth. That kind of information could be dangerous in the wrong hands." The Sarah thing drifted closer, its form becoming more solid as it approached. "Shall I prepare the ritual chamber, Master?" "Not yet," Elijah said, his burning gaze never leaving Marcus's face. "First, I want to show our guest the full scope of what he's been investigating. Knowledge should be rewarded, don't you think, Doctor?" Before Marcus could respond, Elijah's hand shot out with inhuman speed, grasping him by the throat. The touch sent waves of cold through his body, and suddenly he could really see what the manor contained. The walls were lined with the spirits of Elijah's victims, dozens of translucent figures trapped between life and death, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and despair. They reached out with ghostly hands, their mouths moving in silent screams that only Marcus could hear. Among them, he recognized several of the missing townspeople, including his uncle Thomas, whose spectral form mouthed a single word over and over: "Run." "Beautiful, isn't it?" Elijah whispered, his breath like ice against Marcus's ear. "They're all here, Doctor. Every soul I've claimed, every life I've absorbed. They exist now as part of my extended consciousness, their memories and experiences adding to my own knowledge and power." Marcus tried to speak, to scream, but no sound emerged from his throat. The vision was overwhelming, centuries of accumulated death and suffering, all feeding into the monstrous entity that Elijah had become. He could see the ritual chamber below, its stones slick with fresh blood, and the otherworldly presence that dwelt there, something vast and alien that regarded human life as nothing more than fuel for its continued existence. "The blood remembers, Doctor," Elijah said, releasing his grip and allowing Marcus to collapse to the floor. "It remembers the pact my ancestor made, the price that was paid, and the power that was gained. Each generation of Thornleys has honored that agreement, and each has grown stronger as a result." Marcus gasped for air, his vision slowly returning to normal, but the knowledge of what he had seen remained, burned into his consciousness like a brand. He understood now that Elijah was not simply a serial killer. He was something far worse, a conduit for forces that existed beyond human comprehension. "You have a choice, Doctor," Elijah said, extending his hand in a gesture that might have been mistaken for kindness, if not for the malevolent intelligence burning in his eyes. "You can join them." He gestured toward the invisible spirits that Marcus now knew surrounded them. "Or you can serve me as Sarah does. The decision is yours." Marcus looked up at the monster wearing a human face, at the Sarah thing that had once been a loving mother, at the manor that had become a gateway for ancient evil. He thought of the townspeople sleeping peacefully in their beds, unaware that death stalked among them. He thought of the children who might be next, of the innocents who would suffer if this creature was allowed to continue its existence. "I choose neither," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. Elijah's smile widened, revealing teeth that gleamed like polished bone. "I was hoping you'd say that. It's been so long since I've had a victim who truly understood what was happening to them. The fear is so much more flavorful when it's informed by knowledge." The ritual chamber called from below, its ancient stones eager for fresh blood. But as Elijah reached for his prey, Marcus made one final desperate gambit. He pulled a small vial from his medical bag and smashed it against the floor. The holy water he had obtained from the town's priest spread across the marble, and where it touched, the very air seemed to scream. Elijah recoiled with a shriek of pain and rage, his form wavering as if the blessed liquid had somehow disrupted his physical cohesion. Marcus ran. Behind him, he could hear Elijah's roar of fury echoing through the manor, followed by the sound of pursuit. But the holy water had bought him precious seconds, and he used them to reach the front door and plunge out into the storm. The snow was falling harder now, creating a white curtain that might provide cover if he could reach the forest. Behind him, the manor's windows blazed with unholy light, and he could hear Elijah's voice calling his name with a sound like breaking glass. Marcus ran through the storm, his medical bag clutched against his chest, knowing that he carried the only evidence of the evil that dwelt in Thornley Manor. The townspeople might not have the courage to act, but there were others. Church authorities, government officials, people who might listen to a doctor's testimony and take action. The blood remembered. but so did he. And somewhere in that memory lay the key to ending the Thornley legacy once and for all. As he disappeared into the swirling snow, Elijah's inhuman howl echoed across the landscape, a sound of rage and hunger that promised this was far from over. The hunt had begun, and only one of them would survive to see the dawn. The Thornley bloodline had endured for generations, fed by darkness and sustained by evil. But for the first time in over a century, it faced a threat that might prove its undoing, the determination of a man who had seen the truth and refused to be silenced. The blood remembered everything, but so did Dr. Marcus Whitmore.